Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. So with that brief pause, we allowed a few more people to join us. Again, my name is Shirlene, and I'm hosting the 3 Pillars of Effective Business Intelligence for today's webinar. We have 2 presenters today, Marius, the CEO of Metric Insights, and Mike, so please welcome both of them. Mike is the VP of Sales at Metric Insights. I will toss it over to them, but before they get started, want to remind everyone that all of the materials from today will be made available post-webinar. And also, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A, and Mike and Marius will get to those after their presentation. With that, I'll let you guys get started.
Thank you, and welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about the 3 pillars of effective BI governance, and we're going to talk about what is effective governance first. Talk about some examples, show you some examples of how to put effective governance into play, and then talk about the life cycle and Q&A. So many organizations, if you ask them, well, what is governance, what's BI governance, people think about data governance. And data governance is, in fact, very important. Obviously making sure that you've got security around the data, that privacy concerns are addressed, that HIPAA or GDPR are addressed, various privacy regulations. That's critical. But if your governance starts and ends with data governance, you're missing half the picture. Because there's another component to BI governance. There's the way that people consume information, right? Your users are not looking usually at the data directly. They're seeing it through BI tools, through a data visualization and reporting layer. And that piece of the puzzle is often doesn't get the attention that it deserves. And so we're going to talk a lot about that in this presentation. So to start off, I want to give you a sense of what a well-governed BI landscape looks like. And as I do this, I invite you to think about your own environment and ask yourself the question, where is it that you sit in this continuum? Are these criteria, are these check marks that we talk through, are these things that are true in your environment, or are there things that you're still working on? So first, in a well-governed environment, there's a happy coexistence between security and discoverability. So it's possible, you of course are making sure that people only are accessing the content that they should have access to, but you're also making it easier for people to find the content that they need to use their jobs. Second, a BI environment that's well governed is more of a garden than a jungle. So what do I mean by that? Well, think about your BI environment. Does it look like a Japanese garden? Everything in its place, well organized, users going through, easily finding what they need, having a path to go through their journey as they explore their BI environment? Or does it look like a jungle? Is it overgrown with duplicate reports or reports and dashboards that are obsolete? Are there 3 different dashboards that measure the same thing with slightly different business rules? Is that the kind of experience that users are encountering when they're going through their experience? Is it a garden or is it a jungle? Because a governed environment is a garden. Then a key measure of effective governance is trust. So do your users trust both that the data that they're looking at is accurate, that they know that it's correct and that it's certified, and that the reporting that they're looking at is applying the right business rules to that data such that it can be trusted? And then another key measure of governance is to know, well, are you seeing high utilization along your BI tool licenses? So in a well-governed environment, the BI team is making sure that the right folks in the organization have those licenses and they're using it for reports that are generating value for the organization. So there's overall high utilization among the BI tool spend that's happening. And then finally, in a well-governed environment, the BI team works in a way that maximizes the business value. So resources are carefully and thoughtfully allocated to the right projects that are going to generate ROI. And there's a process by which that is continuously measured to ensure that it's continuously taking place. So governance, BI tool governance is a challenge, because it's really not just something you can execute in a single silo. It'd be difficult enough to do effective BI governance if you just had Tableau or just had MicroStrategy or just had Click and had a single BI tool. But in most large enterprises, there are multiple tools that people have to contend with. Each of these tools has different types of capabilities around certification, around discoverability, around the ability to add documentation and various information. And yet, to have effective governance, you need a solution that encompasses all of these technologies, that puts it all in a single umbrella and does the governance in a cohesive way. And that's what makes this, in a heterogeneous environment, extraordinarily challenging. So how do you tackle that? Well, there are three pillars to the solution, three pieces of the puzzle that you have to fit together. The first one is around access control. So, and it's about establishing this delicate balance between security and discoverability. So access, again, as you think of it, first, of course, everyone thinks about security, but you have to think beyond that. And you want to think about not only how are you making sure that users don't find the things they shouldn't find, but how are they finding the things they do need to access? So is the information well organized for them? Are they guided through the experience? Is it tagged? Is it discoverable where they can search for it with the same level of ease that they might be able to do when they're looking for something via Google search? So those capabilities there, because that in a well-governed environment, users can find what they need and they can identify things that maybe even they don't have access to, but they might want to request access to. To do this, with effective governance, you need to match up how the different roles or personas in your organization align with the different kinds of content that you have within the organization. So this is about identifying roles or groups within the organization on a persona level, right? Each member of your organization, each user has a particular persona. There's specific groups of content potentially across BI tools that they need to consume to use their job, to do their job, and they need to consume it in a certain way to make that effective. So looking at how they access that content, the journey that they follow to do that, how they do that across all the different content types, and then how they interact with that content. Looking at access control from a functional perspective. So do they publish that content or just consume it? Are they able to download the data or just look at the reports? That kind of information informing the access control that you do is critical to having a well-designed system. So to achieve this, there are four areas that you want to focus on. First, obviously you need a single point of access. So it doesn't make sense if a user needs to have has three or four different ways to get a content, that by definition is not a well-governed environment. It's not a garden. Furthermore, it needs to be standardization around the tagging and the documentation that's in place. So irrespective of whether that object is a Power BI dashboard, a MicroStrategy, a Tableau, it doesn't matter. There should be a consistency in how the user accesses that information, looks at, identifies things based on tags, identifies documentation, tells them when things have changed, all the things that provide the necessary context when a user is looking at the information should be transparent and consistent across different BI tools. There needs to be a well-defined certification process. So users need to know when they're accessing content that they're actually accessing a report that's been certified, that has the right data and the right business rules. And a process needs to be in place to ensure that that happens continuously. And then finally, discoverability. So obviously, you're not going to have discoverability for everything. You might have that HR report that is, very sensitive and you don't want people stumbling into it. But majority of reports, you want to have users aware that they're there. So when they're searching for it, they know, well, maybe I don't have access to this right now. I'm not presented with any sensitive information, but I know enough about this piece of content to know that this is something that's of interest to me based on my search, and I'm going to request access to it. So with that, let me switch over to Mike, and he's going to show you how this is accomplished in Metric Insights.
Yeah, thanks, Marius. So as Marius said, we're going to use Metric Insights as a way of showing you how you might implement some of these practices and processes from a technology perspective. So I've jumped across here to the Metric Insights platform, and The first piece of this, as Marius said, is about having a single place to effectively publish and ultimately access content within the organization in a very structured and consistent way. So what you're looking at here is the Metric Insights platform, and specifically what we call our business intelligence catalog, the piece of the product where it enables you to do this publishing of content. And what this enables essentially analysts across the organization to do is to take the content that they're creating and publish it into this catalog. So each of these tiles that you're looking at here is essentially linking to a particular data source or application, whether that be your BI tools, as Marius has been talking about, whether it be documents that you have out there, whether it be reporting in other systems, really any source of quote unquote BI within the organization. And is attached to a particular report or dashboard on those tools. So you'll see here, I've got tiles coming from Tableau, Power BI, business objects, and data coming in the form of metrics, some documentation, some spreadsheets. Again, each of these is where we've decided that we want to publish a piece of content into this catalog. And when an analyst publishes content, effectively what we're doing is going out and capturing as much metadata as we can about that particular asset, in this case, a Tableau workbook. So obviously what it was called, but also, when's it updating? And also allow that analyst who's publishing it to add in additional metadata in a consistent fashion. And that might be things like the descriptions, it might be the tagging that Marius has touched on. It could be ownership of the content. So ownership is key in understanding who's responsible for the particular asset or dashboard. And in capturing that metadata in one place in a consistent way, regardless of whether we're looking at Tableau or whether it's a, sorry, just go back here, whether it's a Power BI dashboard I might be looking at. Back to the homepage here. Whether it's Power BI, we're consistently entering and capturing metadata in that way. The other thing we capture is an image of what the particular report or dashboard looks like each time it updates. And again, to provide a consistent visual cue to people coming in, consuming this data, what it is they're about to look at. I jumped ahead there, but if you click into a particular asset within that catalog, what you'll see is effectively we embed the content into the portal. So in this case, I have a live version of the Power BI dashboard here. To the user, they didn't necessarily have to know where this content existed. I'm accessing it in a consistent way with the descriptions and tags that we spoke about before, with consistent functionality wrapped around it, whether that's the ability to subscribe to the content or perhaps collaborate around it, with consistent documentation around the content. So perhaps we want to attach definitions or release notes around what the dashboard is. All of that can be done in a consistent way so that from the user perspective, the complexities of the underlying technology is hidden. Another thing Marius mentioned is the concept of certification of this content as well. So in publishing content, oftentimes it has to go through some sort of testing and QA cycle. And if we do that, effectively we can choose to give certain content this sort of green stamp of approval, if you like. And that certification can be done, at the individual element level. And it may be tied to, say, a workflow that is distributed out into the organization. So different teams or individuals might be responsible for certifying and evaluating certain subsets of the content that's getting published. But ultimately, you may want to push that content through this process so that when a user comes into the catalog, either they're just seeing certified content, or they may be seeing a selection of content, some of which is certified, some of which is not yet. But being able to see what content they can trust, and most importantly, who is responsible for it. So if they do have questions, they have someone to reach out to there. So analysts across the business can publish content in here. They can organize it in a consistent way for users. So you'll see we have a category structure down the left-hand side here. So hiding, again, the complexities of how content is organized in the underlying tools, putting it all together in a set of folders or categories that make sense to the business. Then obviously we want to layer on permissions and security to this as well. So I'm just going to jump across to my other browser here. Obviously, as an end user accessing this content, we need to maintain this balance that Marius spoke about between sort of security and discoverability. So typically what happens when a user comes in, I'm logging in as Avery here in another browser, my permissions are ultimately going to dictate what categories of content I have access to down the left-hand side, what tiles I have access to within those categories, and even maybe when I drill into particular content, what's the sort of row level security or filters that get applied for me based on my role within the organization, and pre-filtering that content for those particular users. So permissions are going to ultimately dictate what content I see, but also what I can do with that content. So as Marius mentioned, it's about access, but it's also about functionally what I can do. And obviously in this case, you'll see that I can't edit the content. I actually can't download the content or certain content that's been tagged in that way. So permissions dictate what I see when I come in, but they also dictate what I see when I search as well. So in Metric Insights, we have this sort of Google search engine, but for your BI and your content. So when I come in as a user, I search for particular phrases or keywords. It recommends search terms, but ultimately goes and searches across the content that I have access to as a user, across the different data sources. I can filter by tags, and as we mentioned before, filter out by what is certified versus what isn't, and get a ranked set of results for the stuff that I'm looking for. The final thing that we'll show in this section is the concept of discoverability. So everything that we've been looking at as Avery so far is really driven by her permissions and what she's allowed to see. But as Marius mentioned, there's certain content that, even though it's governed by a set of permissions, you may want to make what we term discoverable. And that means that if people are searching or browsing through the catalog, it may pop up even though they don't have access to it. So an example might be here. I'm going to drill into the procurement set of content here where Avery's on the sales team. She doesn't have access to the procurement dashboards here. But because they've been made discoverable, you'll see that we sort of blur out the image. We put a padlock on it, but they still show up and would show up in her search if she looked for stuff in this area, because that was something she was trying to understand. And in doing that, you can tie it to a workflow that says, okay, I don't have access, but this is interesting to me. This could help me with my job. Request access from the owner of that content, which, if you remember, we've set up as part of the metadata in the first place. So that's kind of phase one in this governance life cycle, is this ability to be able to publish this content in a very structured way into one place that users can access it and search for it and find it. So let's move on to the second piece, Marius.
Thank you, Mike. So once you've got the content published and it's accessible and discoverable and secure, the next area of focus for effective governance is really looking at resource optimization. Now, here we're talking about three different areas of resources. Obviously, the content, the content has a life cycle to it. So today's hot dashboard, tomorrow may become obsolete because the business has changed. So there has to be a whole process for managing that content lifecycle, monitoring whether you're getting engagement out of it, promoting it, and so forth, and then eventually deprecating it if it's reached end of life. There's also the process of managing licenses. So, obviously big expense is the BI tool licenses that you're spending money on, making sure that those are allocated in a way that they're actually being utilized and that the right number of licenses are being utilized by the right people. And then the most scarce and valuable resource that you have at your disposal is your BI team. So understanding how how's that BI team allocated across different projects, and then looking at the data to inform the process of allocation to make sure that they in fact these resources are spending time on problems that are generating true ROI for the business. So let's talk about this in more detail. In the absence of good governance, oftentimes the de facto model that companies kind of fall back on is the squeaky wheel gets the grease model. Right? So whoever shouts the loudest gets attention. BI in this kind of model, BI teams are often working on fires for a very large percentage of the time. They're moving on from one sort of hotspot in the business to another, addressing whoever is sort of screaming about the fact that they don't have the reporting they need. And there are major issues. So this model, while it's good at addressing a crisis, doesn't really work long term, because there are oftentimes many other parts of the business that are not screening that do need attention, and over time a lot of frustration gets generated by people that just feel like they're not getting the proper attention. And sometimes the folks that are screaming quite loud, in fact, if you look at what you create for them and you look at engagement maybe 6 months down the line, you find that, well, that thing that was really needed and was really important, 6 months later, it's hardly getting used at all. So a better model needs to be in place, a more thoughtful, careful way to approach this. And that model needs to consider sort of the BI content itself and what kind of engagement is there in place, the license spend, and the time that your team is spending, and looking at what is the net usage and ROI that's generated out of those efforts. Really, the question here is the juice worth the squeeze? Is all that effort, all that cost, did it generate something that in the end, if you look back at what you did last month, the month before that, last year, did these things generate the expected levels of usage and ROI for the business? And then having that insight inform how you then allocate these resources going forward. And that's the key to effective governance. So to achieve this, there are three things you need to do. You need to understand usage tracking at a very granular level. So irrespective of how users interact with the content, whether they're doing it, receiving something via email or clicking on it and interactive, doing it within a portal when it's embedded, or going at it directly within a tool. Irrespective of those, understanding the usage patterns around the community and the content that they're consuming by persona, and then having that guide the decision-making process of how resources are allocated towards creating new content. Understanding how BI tool licenses themselves are utilized is very important. So it's not uncommon. We've seen this in many organizations. In poorly governed situations, half of the licensing tools are maybe not being utilized. There was a team that said everyone's got to have a BI tool in my organization. Those were allocated. If you look at it 6 months, 9 months later, maybe half of the people in the organization are actually using it. Huge amount of waste is taking place there in terms of unused licensing. And then the content itself, having the right tools in place to be able to determine, what's the content that's underutilized and needs to be promoted, because it's a gem that maybe people don't know about. But then what is the content that has reached end of life, that was useful 6 months ago, is no longer useful now based on usage, and perhaps needs to be deprecated? So those levers, having those capabilities is very important. And Mike is going to show you in a moment how, with Metric Insights, you can achieve some of these.
Yeah, so let's jump back over to the product here. So as Mary said, the real important piece about this is again, understanding usage at a very sort of detailed level in terms of being able to inform the effectiveness of your BI efforts. So what we do in Metric Insights is very much capture usage of content at every touch point that it might occur. So what does that mean, actually? Let's just jump away from this for a minute. So where might I be accessing content? Well, I might be accessing it through the portal, like we were looking at before, and engaging with that by going through the catalog that we spoke about. Equally, I may have accessed this report through the portal, but then maybe I bookmark this one directly in Tableau, and it's I'm accessing it directly within the Tableau environment. Or maybe I've subscribed to certain content and I'm accessing it via email. I'm receiving this in an email every day, and I may or may not click through into that. I may get the information I need within the email itself. But really, regardless of where I'm accessing that content, that is ultimately going to drive what is the usage for a particular asset that we've published. And so by pulling that all together and looking at it across the different data sources and tools that we might be using, across the different categories of content, across the different users that we have within user groups within the organization, we can start to get an indication of what is most popular right now over the last sort of 30, 60, 90 days, what's doing well and increasing in popularity because it's useful. And then conversely, what is going unused right now, or what is decreasing in popularity. And by looking at these sort of higher level numbers, I can start to get an indication of sort of what people are looking at. But that's really only sort of part of the story. I may have published this dashboard 60 days ago, promoted it, everyone went and looked at it on day one because I made it available. But how do I know whether people are truly engaging with it? And so I need to be able to drill down into these numbers to really understand the details behind these engagement patterns. So let's take an example. Maybe I created that Tableau sales dashboard 60, 90 days ago. I published it. As I mentioned before, it got a lot of views on day one. But by looking at visualizations like this, if I just play this forward, over that time period, who came in and engaged with it? So what you're looking at here is I have the piece of content in the middle, and the concentric circles around that are the days since someone looked at that content. And you can see the, in this case, it's users, it might be user groups in a larger organization. As they look at the content, they come into the center of the circle. As they then, stop engaging with that content, they drift to the outside over time. So I can really use this to say, is this a useful piece of content? Because if I see people coming back in and engaging with it, and I can see who those groups are or those users are, that gives me good insight into the engagement with this particular report. Also looking at this from, so that's really from the content perspective, also looking at this from a user or user group perspective. Oftentimes you're dealing with large enterprises, different characteristics between the different personas that are accessing BI in your organization. So we want to look at it from that perspective as well. So, whether that's, looking at a similar visualization, but from a user perspective down here, so which, if I take a user or a user group, what content did they engage with this time over time? Is there content that they looked at once that is drifting outside of the circle because they didn't find it useful? And what are they looking at on a regular basis by the different categories of content? And again, that might inform where I place my efforts. And then finally, from a search perspective as well. So what are people looking for, and are they successful in finding content that's out there already, or are they searching for keywords and things that we don't have content for today that might be an indication of, again, where we want to place our efforts? So understanding usage at that sort of level is really important to then having a way to manage the catalog of content that we've been talking about. So as we mentioned sort of all along, BI is sort of this changing beast over time. What's useful today or what was useful sort of 6 months ago might not be useful today. What we need to create in the future is different to what we have now. Businesses are always changing and evolving. So when we see things like this, where content isn't getting used, it gives us the ability to say, okay, is this content that's sort of run its course and we should be deprecating it, taking out of the catalog, retiring it? Or is it content that we feel should be useful and actually we should be promoting it to our users? And if it's the latter, we can start to, again, automate the process of promoting this content. So if we go back to our end user here, things like, how do I know as a user what new content has been added to the portal over time? Well, we know what content has been added. We know what users are looking at. So why don't we send Avery a digest or show her within the portal, hey, here's the new content that was added this week that you haven't looked at yet. Maybe this is something that you might want to go and check out because it could be interesting to you. Or, here's the content that you haven't looked at yet. We know that from the data. We know which user groups you belong to. And when we look at the other users within those user groups, they find these 3 dashboards most popular and most useful. Therefore, here's some recommendations. Go check this content out. It might be interesting to you. So using that usage data to better sort of, as Marius's analogy of sort of keeping a tidy garden, making sure the content remains relevant and useful for people, and removing clutter, which is probably one of the biggest barriers to high engagement. The final thing I'll touch on in this section is then tying that as well into license utilization. So as Marius said, you're paying lots of money in most cases for licenses for each of these different reporting tools that we're talking about, that we're connecting to here. And so if we understand the true usage of the content within these tools, we can start to map that against the license costs that you have. That might be at different tiers of a license that you're seeing here. And ultimately, again, over different periods of time, understand which users or groups of users are not actually engaging with a particular tool, and the cost implications of that. So if there are users who aren't using their licenses, or groups of users that aren't using their licenses, is that because we need to engage with them and train them and get them and understanding the value of that particular tool? Or is it just the fact that we allocated licenses to everyone and these users don't need them, therefore we should stop paying for them? Or have we allocated licenses at a certain functional level where users really just go and look at the reports, they don't need the capability of publishing new reports, and we can downgrade their license? And ultimately understand, out of everything we're paying, are we throwing money away, or are we missing an opportunity to get a particular cohort of users engaged with the product? So that's kind of the second piece of this is the resource optimization and looking at it from those 3 angles.
Thank you, Mike.
Let's move on to the third piece, Marius.
Yeah, so Mike showed you how some of these tools can help you to turn the jungle more into a garden, and also be wiser in the ways that the resources are allocated, so that it can be more effective resource optimization. The third piece of the puzzle is generating trust around analytics. Trust is obviously very important, both trust in the data itself and the content, so that I, as a user, know when I'm looking at a piece of a dashboard or report that it's actually relevant to what I'm trying to discover, and it's going to give me meaningful information. And also in the BI team, I have this trust to say this BI team is producing content that is relevant to me, and they're communicating with me, and I trust that they have my best interests in heart, and that's a really pivotal part of the puzzle. And the reality is, and I've heard this from many BI practitioners, I experienced this myself when I was a BI practitioner, that you can never be perfect. So you can find that your team may work for months to make sure that data quality is really good, and that you're providing real high quality information. And sure enough, at one point, some executive stumbles across the data that's incorrect because something happened with the data load that day. If they're the ones that discover that, it can be catastrophic, because it is 100 times easier to lose trust than it is to gain trust. And once you've lost trust, it's really hard to gain it back. So this is the conundrum that we're all facing. And I think to solve for this, knowing that you're never going to be perfect, it's critical to have transparency. And that means both that analysts know from a data perspective, know when there are data issues, that those have occurred, and they can take prompt action to resolve them, but also the business is aware when there's an issue, so that rather than them, a business user discovering an issue on their own and then alerting the BI team to that, which is never a good outcome. It happens the other way. It's the BI team proactively figuring out that something's going on and then giving a heads up to the user that, hey, today there's something going on here which we're investigating. You might not want to trust this data today. That action just generates a huge amount of increase in trust in the BI team and the data. And so there are three key areas or key things that you want to be able to accomplish to do this. First of all, clearly automated data quality is essential. You can't have your BI team checking the data every single day. That's an enormous amount of effort that is not a good use of resources. So having a mechanism by which, irrespective of whether that data is in a BI tool or in a data warehouse, or being delivered through some data science applications, having a way to ensure that there's quality in that data is essential. Then it's important to be able to effectively communicate any issues, so that both covers scenarios where the data analyst needs to know that, hey, we're loading a lot fewer rows today than we were yesterday. Maybe there's something we need to look at, and having that happen before the end user will look at the data. But also communication with a business user. Hey, we're investigating this issue, and so heads up, there might be some problems here. You don't look at this data right just now. That kind of communication is very important. And all of this communication needs to be highly targeted to the correct users. So it does you no good to send a communication to your finance team telling them that the marketing data source is having an issue. That just sort of wastes their time and does the opposite of engender trust in the BI team and in the processes. So it's very important to be highly targeted in the communication. So let us show you how that works in Metric Insights.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to think about here, I think, and there can be a couple of layers to sort of this data trust aspect of it. So let's take a look at some examples here. So within Metric Insights, we have the ability to connect to essentially the underlying data behind these assets that we've published into the portal. And in doing that, we can look at unusual events that might be happening in the data by tracking essentially key metrics or exceptions. And that could be from a couple of perspectives. The first one I'm going to look at is more from sort of an IT perspective. And so maybe for our critical data sets that we're building reports off of, we want to automate the process of sort of tracking, in this case, the number of rows that are getting loaded every day into the different data sets or tables that we might be interested in. And we know that consistently, we see a certain level of volume in that content. And equally, this could be also things like the time that the jobs are taking to load them, but really an indication of what's normal. And by instrumenting these metrics within the Metric Insights platform, what we do when you set up metrics is we start to track how they're changing over time. So in this case, where we're loading tables of data, we're tracking the number of rows that get loaded every day. We're running a statistical analysis against that data to say, are there any unusually high or low values as we pull this data in? Did we load the data twice and we've got a massive number of rows by mistake? Or did the network go down and we have no rows, or it failed halfway through the load? And so by setting up these metrics, our platform has this alerting capability. And so you can see here where we're looking for statistical outliers within this series of data volume across the different tables. And anywhere we're finding this statistically significant outlier, this is something that I can be alerted to as an owner of this particular data set. And we'll look at some alert types in a minute and how I might receive that. But this gives me a chance to get ahead of the game here before the actual reports get published to the end users. Equally, yeah, maybe actually what we want to check as well is the business metrics that we're actually showing within those dashboards and reports. So in this case, rather than the number of rows, maybe as an analyst, I know this particular, this Tableau dashboard that we were looking at before, or this Power BI dashboard with sales data, it's critical to the business every day. Anytime there's a mistake with the data, I get a phone call, telling me, and that again generates a level of distrust with the team. So by instrumenting the key metrics from that dashboard, in this case, sales across the different regions, again, we can apply that sort of outlier algorithm to say, okay, anytime that we get statistically significant highs or lows within the data for our business metrics, in this case, sales, I want to know about that straight away, the moment the data loads, because then I can go and look into it and say, or reach out to my data team and say, hey, does this look like we've got an issue with data? Or do we really think there's a business issue here that we need to go and address? And so that allows me, again, to get ahead of the game. And I could receive this content, these alerts, on my cell phone. I could receive it via email. It could drive me to, again, here's an email saying, issue with the row count in one of the tables that loaded. Or equally, it could be an alert that notifies me that one of the business metrics in that key dashboard from Tableau for a particular region, has a particularly high or low value today. Go check this out before we send out the alerts to everyone else in Canada saying there's a problem here. And let's double check the data is correct before it goes out. And in generating these alerts, we can also tie them to perhaps a workflow to make sure, this comes to me, I acknowledge I've seen it, I move it through resolution that says, okay, I've checked it, the data looks good. Let's send out the business alerts and we can get on this and figure out what was going on in Canada. So automating that data quality process, and then the second piece is around communication of that. So if we go back to our other user here, Avery, we're back in her catalog here. In Metric Insights, we have a number of ways of sort of communicating those sort of issues, and they can either be automated, so we can tie this to sort of the alerting that gets generated to preempt the issues, or it may be something that, again, we put into the hands of the analysts or the data folks to manually create these. But we have the concept of announcements through the platform. These could be, through the portal itself. We had an issue with our Tableau server. Things are problematic there right now. It could be within an email I might receive. Could be specific to a particular tile or data source. Our data load was delayed because we had network issues. Again, communicating that on the right content to the right people, making sure only the people who are interested in this particular type of data, they're the ones that are being notified of it. So let's jump back to the deck.
Thank you, Mike.
Wrap up here.
So to wrap up, want to be able to really put everything in context here. So this diagram really shows the BI governance lifecycle, and it really it applies whether you're using Metric Insights or you've put together your own set of tools to do BI governance. Irrespective of that, these are the pieces that you need to have in place. So you can see here there are two essentially concentric circles that form the shape. On the left-hand side, you've got content optimization, and that's all about continuously making sure that the right content is in your portal. So that starts with the top with tracking usage. That could again be usage outside of Metric Insights. We pull in, as Mike said, the usage information from all different BI tools, and we can analyze and tell you which tools you want to onboard into a portal that you want to be able to consume. And then once it's on the portal, identifying how that consumption changes over time. So then for that content, looking at building and deploying new content, again, based on the usage patterns, what are the groups and users that are underserved, which probably need additional information, additional analytics, going out, reaching out to them, surveying them, figuring out how to develop right content to address that particular audience, and then closing the cycle with analysis associated with ROI for that. And then measuring engagement. So you've gone ahead and your development team, your BI team has spent a month building out new reports and onboarding new data. Well, what's the engagement with that new content that you created 3 or 6 months down the line? So being able to continuously measure that and inform the process with that. And then based on that data, promoting and purging content. So Mike showed some of the tools we have for that in Metric Insights. It's very important to both end of life things that no longer need to be used, to remove the clutter, so that that all that dead wood that's there in the jungle goes away and it becomes more like a garden. And also to promote content that maybe is underutilized because people are not aware of it. So that has to be done as well. And then that feeds into the management of the team. So these tools can be used as part of a process on an ongoing basis to make sure that the BI team is actually spending time on projects that are generating true ROI, not flash in the pan type successes for a few weeks, followed by decline in usage until they're no longer used some number of months down the line. And then as well, optimizing the BI resources that are available to you. So either downscaling the number of licenses, if in fact you don't have the usage that you need, or reallocating those licenses to the right groups within the organization so that people are actually getting value out of this significant financial investment that your organization is making in BI tool licenses. And as you see in this diagram, this is almost like an infinity symbol because it's intended to say that, this is an ongoing process. It's a never-ending journey. It's not a one and done type situation for BI governance. You need to start that journey, start the discipline, and then continuously progress on that, continuously to iterate, to continuously improve over time. So, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so with that, that kind of concludes the slide aspect of this. So we'd like to spend the rest of the time on any questions that people may have. So we, as Charlene just mentioned in the chat window there, if people have questions, feel free to type them into the chat or the Q&A window, and we'll get those answered. I see some coming in already actually here, Marius. So let's start with these. So, so where do you start with governance as it's related to what you've been talking about? Maybe you can start with that one. I think it's a good question.
Yeah, so we talked about a lot of different aspects there, and I don't think you need to boil the ocean in your efforts. Again, whether you're using a tool like Metric Insights or doing something on your own, either way, I think one place, a very practical place to start, is to look at the usage that you have around engagement within the BI platforms that you have today. So really every single BI platform has some form of usage data that you can extract out of it. And you can take a look at that and see, well, what are the reports that are getting utilized? What are the reports that are not getting utilized? What trends and patterns can you understand for that? Even if you have to do that analysis in Excel or within the BI tool, that's a really good place to start because it gives you a sense of how people are engaging. And then the second step I would take, kind of in parallel with that, is do some surveys of your audience, to understand, what do they perceive as their pain points, especially those members of the audience that are not utilizing BI to the extent that you'd expect them to. So if you're looking at a number of reports, dashboards you created last year, your team built out, and you're seeing low utilization, it's a good opportunity to engage those teams in dialogue and understand what is preventing that. Is it a data issue? Maybe the dashboard's overwhelming. Is it a problem that there's not the right information there? Or it's not delivered in the right way? How is it that the information is delivered is not aligning with that user journey? That's a really good place to start. And then, gradually build out into the other aspects of the process over time.
Okay, so second question here. So what effective certification processes have you seen related to BI content?
Yeah. So certification is obviously very important. Like Mike showed you, certification allows you to know that not only that something can be trusted, but gives you that a traceability to know who actually certified this content and when. We've seen a number of different models for certification. Everything from a very simple model where, when a content is onboarded, only certified content is brought on and a user certifies once, and it's a one and done kind of a model, to other situations where you see things need to be recertified. So you can put certification through a workflow where perhaps, for example, you might have a banking application where every month you need to recertify the numbers or financials or something like this. And so at the end of the month, when an object automatically goes out of certification mode while it's being certified, it can go through multiple stages where each different users, different personas are processing the certification through each stage. And once it's fully certified, it regains the certification model. So anything from very simple to very complex can be handled.
Right, so we saw a report which includes data errors. So are the source systems connected to metric insights? Yeah, so within metric insights, you can hook up to the underlying data sources. So whether that be databases or whatever that might be. So we can track at that sort of level. So that's where perhaps the number of rows or the load times were coming from. Yeah, again, whether that's a database, whether it's your CRM platform, whatever it might be. So the stuff that's driving the reporting, conversely, we can pull the data out of the reports themselves, which is kind of the second example I showed, where, within a particular dashboard, let's instrument a particular metric that's coming into that dashboard and track the business metric itself, either again for business alerting purposes or for data quality.
Yeah, and just to add a few things to what Mike said, another common use case that we're seeing is that for some of our customers, they will run these data quality checks and metric insights against the source data before they do the report distribution, before they publish the reporting to users, right? So it's a key sort of check mark in the process. And another sort of check that is also very common is when we pull the data from a BI tool itself. Imagine, from a Tableau or Power BI or MicroStrategy, we get that data, and then we compare that to a reference point data from another system. And that kind of quality check, make sure that things balance, that nothing in the entire onboarding process and pipelining of that data occurred such that that critical number in the BI tool does not accurately represent what's actually in the source system. So that's another sort of mechanism for data quality.
There's a few questions here related to the same subject, I think, Marius, but can you talk about unifying security across the different tools and BI applications?
Yeah, so that's very important, and typically the way that we accomplish this is through LDAP integration or Active Directory integration. So what you would do is you create Active Directory groups that are aligned with the particular personas in the groups, and then you make sure that same Active Directory group persists through all the different tools that grant access to users to their content. That also is used by Metric Insights. We have deep integration with Active Directory, so you can do all kinds of fairly advanced things, dynamic provisioning, and so forth as well. So all that is possible, and it all sits on top of your existing AD or LDAP infrastructure within your organization.
Good. Well, I think we're coming to the end of time here. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Hopefully you found this interesting. As Shirley mentioned, we will share the content of this with everyone afterwards. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you for joining, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.